I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to SLEERICKETS, a podcast about poetry and other intractable problems. So, how shall I begin? I've been reading in preparation for some other episodes, and as often happens, I got a little bit distracted. So, I was looking again recently at this essay Jonathan wrote 5 years ago, or he published 5 years ago in the Millions, called When I Mean I. The essay is all about kind of how we use the term speaker in talking about poems. We came up on the podcast before. I won't recap it all, but he thinks that maybe we have gotten in the habit of using the term speaker in a way that's not all that consistent with the actual way the poems work, or the authors think about the poems themselves. One of the sub theses of the essay is that there is a little bit of an equivocation game happening in contemporary poetry sometimes, where there's a sort of an understanding that readers have intuitively that we are reading the work of the poet himself, but that the poet sort of always has plausible deniability by claiming that it's a speaker. And he gives the one example of a poet who wrote a whole book about the death of a beloved, family. I can't forget if it was a family member or a lover. And then when an audience at a reading was very moved by this, and a member of the audience, asked him about this person's death, the poet was perplexed. Well, why would you assume this was a real person? Why would you assume I actually had lost somebody? This was all fiction, right? So he talks about kind of when we do and don't assume there's a person behind the speaker, or a persona behind the speaker. As I said, it was in preparation for a totally different episode that I will get to at some point. But while I was sort of chewing this back over, an email popped up in my inbox from Chris Childers' Substack newsletter called Kalida Junctura, which I believe means beautiful junction, or juncture, or intersection. And it's a Horatian term having to do with like a nicely chosen collision of sounds and meanings. I don't know. I'm not going to try to explicate Latin for when Chris could do it better himself. But he had this, he put out an entry in his newsletter called Locating Voice. And I just knew immediately from the title that it was going to be something of interest to me. So I finally read it yesterday and gobbled it up, and it sent me to, yet another essay. But I want to talk a little bit about Chris's essay, and then the essay he reminded me of, and then maybe some other things. But all of this is dealing with the concept of voice in poetry. So Jonathan and I had a whole episode all about voice, how I specifically think about voice in poetry, how there is a convention of using the term voice to refer to a sort of a trademark sound or shtick or quality that a poet's poems reliably have. That is the primary meaning that people assume when they hear the word voice in the context of contemporary poetry. For my purposes, I tend to think of voice more in terms of the voice of the poem, or the voice of the speaker of the poem. That is, that I am concerned with what sounds speakable, credible to me, that it could be spoken by a being theoretically. And part of what I really enjoyed about Chris's essay is that he takes on this question of voice as something belonging to the poet beyond the individual poem, and he's pretty skeptical of it. So he starts out by talking about his own experience with his voice. So he, like me, was a nerd born in the South who then took some pains to modify his speaking voice in certain ways. I guess less speaking. He does talk a little bit about how he places his voice specifically, but beyond the resonance of the voice, he's talking about accent. He's talking about how he pronounce, the cadence of his language, the sounds of his vowels, the crispness of his consonants, and as well as his diction and syntax. So he had this experience frequently while he was a waiter at a very fancy Baltimore restaurant where I was lucky enough to have him get me drunk after hours there once on just a wild variety of liquors, including a very blue one. He was a waiter there for a number of years while working on the Penguin book of Greek and Latin lyric verse, because I guess nobody but a restaurant was interested in hiring arguably the best classicist of my generation. But while working there, he had an experience that was very familiar to me, which was that people thought he was from somewhere else. Sometimes somewhere else in the country, sometimes from a different country, sometimes, people from Europe or from the British Isles often thought he was from Europe or the British Isles, though never quite the country they came from. I very much shared this experience. I had this, very often in Atlanta throughout my childhood and adolescence. I had people ask if I was British. Certainly they didn't think I was from Atlanta, where I was born and raised. And Chris talks about trying to isolate precisely what it was that threw people off. He says, on the one hand, instead of the expected Balmer drawl, Balmer is how natives of Baltimore tend to pronounce the word Baltimore. Instead of the expected Balmer drawl, I spoke with a distinct muted southernness they couldn't quite place. I also really appreciate that in the essay, not just in that one line, but I think elsewhere, Chris distinguishes between Baltimore and the South, because every single Northerner that I met in Baltimore thought we were in the Deep South, whereas all of my friends from Atlanta literally referred to Baltimore as New England. So I appreciate Chris distinguishing Baltimore from the South. It is, after all, north of the Mason-Dixon. He says, on the one hand, instead of the expected Balmer drawl, I spoke with a distinct muted southernness they couldn't quite place. On the other, my academic interests had no doubt shaped my diction and syntax in ways they would have found perfectly ordinary in a classroom, but which surprised them from a purveyor of crispy Brussels sprouts and duck ravioli. The poor patrons did not know what they were dealing with. I think he's right that probably part of what threw off his patrons was not just how his voice sounded or how his vowels sounded, but the way Chris talks. If you looked at it on the page, right? He says, if there existed a transcript of whatever I said, would it be clear from the text what had confounded them? And I think, probably it's like 50-50 odds. Knowing Chris, he does speak in a sort of a slightly otherworldly way. When you get to know him, it's incredibly winning, and he's a very sweet and generous and thoughtful guy. But there is something palpably not necessarily affected, but like artificial, or somehow, to me, what it reads as a little bit as Southern nerd, right? It's very familiar to me. It's absolutely the sort of thing I have heard people say about my own speech my whole life. And I can imagine that when people were responding to his voice, they were responding as much as anything to his manner, to probably his posture, his carriage, because even when he was waiting tables, he carried himself like an avuncular Latin teacher, which is what he is. He goes on, and this is, I have to say, the subtlest form of damnation from Chris. He says, in his essay on discourse, Mikhail Bakhtin has this essay called Discourse in the Novel. In this essay, Bakhtin has a lot to say about a phenomenon he calls heteroglossia. Heteroglossia, different or varied tongues, languages. While I found most of his specific statements basically unintelligible, a hazy general idea nonetheless emerged. And to paraphrase Brian Platzer, if Chris Childers has a hard time understanding your essay on literature, that should at least give you pause. That should at least make you consider perhaps you could have been clearer, because he should be at least Chris should understand it. While I found most of his specific statements basically unintelligible, a hazy general idea nonetheless emerged, which is that the study of style in a novel should not merely focus on the way the narrator builds sentences, but on all the voices the book contains and how they relate to and interact with each other. So this is Chris sort of takes this as being maybe the meaning of heteroglossia, that it is not necessarily as meaningful to say like what is the style of the novel overall as to say like what does the novel contain and how do all of these different styles and voices that it contains work together. Now, this seems like a not especially radical notion in the context of a novel in which, presumably, a lot of literally different characters are talking. And so you do literally have the voices, multiple voices, right? It gets a little bit curiouser and subtler when you come to lyric poetry. But he goes on, he says, those like me, this is Chris, those like me who first dipped our toe into the creative industrial college writing complex in the early aughts could not escape the idea that a voice is something we all have if only we could find it. This is the cliche. You study creative writing to find your voice as a writer, as a poet, specifically because boy, poets, we don't have a whole lot else, but at least we can cling to the notion that we have an essential and authentic voice. I've always been skeptical, Chris says. I share his skepticism. Sure, plenty of major writers do have a distinctive, recognizable voice, but is it actually a voice or a manner? Especially if the writer is capable of sounding like lots of people besides himself. He gives the example of Seamus Heaney. Heaney connects the distinctive sound of his poetry, which I associate primarily with short, grunting, consonant-encrusted monosyllables. Encrusted is a nice Heaney-esque choice there. Heaney connects the distinctive sound of his poetry to his own speaking voice and the Ulster accent he grew up around as a child, which, he says memorably, strikes the tangent of the consonant rather more than it rolls the circle of the vowel. Anything that helped him produce his poems is to the good. That is Chris's very classy and somewhat high-handed way of saying, whatever floats your fucking boat, man. Great, sure, that sounds fine. But for me, at least, when I turn to him, this is Chris, but for me, at least, when I turn to him, I don't do so to hear that Heaney sound. I do it to read good poems. And I'm entirely with him there. There are poems of Heaney's that really, really sound like him that I'm not especially fond of. And there are poems of his that don't sound quite as much like him, though maybe not a lot of examples of that, that I like perfectly well. He goes on, he says, it seems to me that the problem of locating the voice, of pinning it or penning it down, that's a kind of like a nice subtle little joke, picking up on his own professed inability to distinguish between short I's and short E's when preceding the letter N or some other kind of consonant that he has the fancy name for and I don't. It seems to me that the problem of locating the voice is another version of the problem of locating consciousness or the self. The voice is quite literally an emergent property. We summon it by coordinating the efforts of most of what surrounds and surmounts the belly button and send it forth to fly and fade. This is the most woo-woo sentence Chris has ever written that I know of, but I think it's pretty true. He says, like many life energies, voice is a verb disguised as static by the noun that names it. I think I mostly agree with him. I wrote an essay on voice, among other things, years ago in Smartish Pace, and I was trying to kind of identify like how I understood voice in myself. And I think like Chris makes a lot of, and he quotes I think it's a New Yorker writer, Colapinto, who blew out his own voice and damaged his voice from sort of had a traumatic experience that physically damaged his vocal cords. There's a person in my family recently who had a physical trauma to the vocal cords that substantially weakened it, that like physically altered the shape of the vocal cords and in that way made the sound much weaker and raspier. So like Chris makes much of how the voice is not just the product of the vocal cords, but is the product of many different parts of the body all working in concert in a particular moment of breath, and that it's not a static entity. That's true. I also do think that there's I think the way I put it in the essay in Smartish Pace, it was an essay on Joshua Beckman's poems and my ambivalence about them, my love for and ambivalence about them. I think the way I put it was that like the voice is the sound that the language makes when it passes through your own mind, which is maybe a similarly woo-woo sentiment. But, I think that in the same way that we have each of us has a word hoard, right? Like Beowulf, each of us has a collection of all the words that we know. And it's arranged not alphabetically, but QWERTYUOP style according to readiness to hand, right? That there are words we reach for more readily, not just because they're more common, but because they're more familiar to us. Ryan pointed out, he says, plenty of smart people have go-to jokey polysyllabic words they will reach for when they need to fill a slot. And he pointed out that one of mine was the word prehensile, at which point I tried as much as possible to stop using that word. But it's right. And I mean, nothing will teach you, quicker than editing your own audio, which words you overuse, which words you get in the habit of using. And often, it's not just that one has a word hoard that is arranged according to one's own QWERTYUOP, frequency of usage, but that a culture or a moment has a word hoard. And they're words that move in and out of fashion, and even pronunciations of words that move in and out of fashion. So I tend to think that each of us has this sort of word hoard, again, arranged in this peculiar way according to our own familiarity and usage and comfort. And then in addition to just raw store of words, we also have a landscape, right? That there are certain patterns of speech, there's certain constructions, there are rhetorical devices that are similarly kind of more readier to hand to us. Like there may be certain constructions that are so alien that I would never happen upon one unless I, coincidentally constructed it from scratch. But there are other constructions, anaphora being the one that leaps immediately to mind, and that is extremely common and very easy to use, the repetition of an initial word or phrase, usually in the peroration of a speech, as we'll return to later. There's certain constructions, certain patterns, certain textures of speech that are similarly, familiar to each one of us. Each one of us has in his hoard, it's not just a word hoard, it's a syntax hoard, right? It's a grammar hoard, it's a register, it's a tonal hoard as well, right? There's some people who tend to speak. Brian, I remember, it was always a little unnerving to me in graduate school. He would in the middle of conversations, he would turn to me and he would say, "You are so sincere." He would say it not as an appreciation or an accusation, but as an expression of mere surprise and maybe kind of like fond amusement, like when you observe that your child still doesn't understand how to put words in the past tense. But there are people for whom certain tones are readier, are more familiar. That's also part of your the hoard of language-related things that makes up your own peculiar stamp as a speaker. Chris, he takes that as a sort of a given. He says, like, okay, yes, each of us does develop a certain pattern, a certain tendency, a certain habit of speech. I remember saying I think I've said it on the podcast before, but I remember saying to Ryan years ago, he said something about my style as a poet, and I said, isn't having a style sort of a bad thing, sort of a liability? And his response was, not if it's a good style. But that's basically what Chris says. Like, sure, each of us is going to develop a certain touch with the language that if we write a lot of stuff that is worth reading and somebody bothers to read all of it, probably he will see that there's certain things that are consistent across this. Like, he will start to recognize our voice. His main point, though, because he is a translator, is that more important than the peculiar, it's not so much a trademark as like a watermark, I think, the way Chris thinks of it. It's a subtle giveaway, a subtle indication of who you are as a poet that is not the main event of any one poem. He says, as the non-multitudinous author of a rather hefty tome consisting of 80 plus quite different poets who lived and wrote over the course of some 8 centuries, this is the Penguin collection, it is fair to ask how a single individual with a single instrument could give voice to such diversity. Chris is expressed in the podcast, he is not a believer that the translator needs to somehow be a good match for the poet, or kind of like line up his essence with the essence of the poet, or kind of chime spiritually across the centuries. He thinks that translation is a craft, and you can be better and worse at it, but if you're commissioned to do a translation, you do the fucking translation, and you do it as well as you can, and you do it as truthfully to the original as you can, making adjustments as necessary. There is an essay, I think he ended up putting it in his newsletter, I'll try to find it, that he presented at, it was probably the best thing I heard at the last LSCW conference. It was on his translation of Ovid and how he made a radical change to the form of the poem and to Ovid's reference to his own form in order to make it make more sense to our ears in English. So, he's a very dynamic translator. He's truthful, but he is never slavish. He says, it was always one of the things I worried about. How could I make poets as different as Archilochus, Anacreon, Pindar, Philodemus, and Catullus sound like themselves and not like me? My answer is that, in translation at least, voice is a problem and product of technique. I didn't realize it at the time, but Bakhtin's notion of heteroglossia may fit well with what my book is trying to do. Playing not only voices, but various formal and stylistic choices off against each other to create, hopefully, that feeling of a profusion of poets talking to and at and over each other, ex uno plura. I sort of, I'm on board. I don't know how convinced I am. I also think about, I think about playwrights, I think about, novelists, people who write out characters. And it's funny because what's often the case is that the writers, even the writers of many voices that we come to love the most, it's not necessarily because when we read back over their work, all of their characters sound so different from one another. Rather, we're likely to say, oh, he sounds like a Shakespeare character. Or at a much lower brow, he sounds like an Aaron Sorkin character. He sounds like a Harold Pinter character. He sounds like that. He sounds like a Beckett character. And I don't think it's that there aren't real distinctions made across these different characters, but I do think that where I'm very much with Chris is in thinking that one of the worst things you can do as a poet is to take the concept of your own voice very seriously. Similarly, I think it is dangerous to take the concept of an individual character's voice too seriously. That tends to lead to corny or offensive dialect choices or verbal tics. Most often when people are speaking, they're speaking, this is my inner David Mamet coming out. They're speaking in order to try to get what they want. They're not speaking in order to try to sound like themselves. And so, I think in a way, the truest thing Chris says about translating many voices is don't fucking overthink it, man. Calm down about voice. Try to say it clearly. Try to say it as well as the original author said it, and don't worry so much about whether or not you sound like him, or this guy sounds like this, or you sound like you. He does give the example of a passage that Haney translates from Virgil, which he says is very fun and cool to listen to, but doesn't sound a lick like Virgil and sounds 1,000,000% like Seamus Haney. The distinction he goes on, and this is, I've probably stolen his thunder a little bit, but he closes by saying, gallivanting off to the Dagobah system in search of one's own voice is the wrong approach. Even worse is scanning the pre-existing stylistic constellations for a patch of empty sky where you can insert a shtick nobody has hit on yet. This is what I very much associate with Knott's era Iowa school poets. They were always sort of grasping for an available poetic shtick that they could stamp as their own and, claim and make, so that the goal being, as I remember somebody explaining to me at the time, that each of them could publish a poem in a magazine, even anonymously, and it should be instantly recognizable as being by that person, right? The most salient example is Chelsea Minnis, she says, the ... girl was what she called herself, somewhat ruefully, because all of her poems were awash in a grid of ellipses. So it's true, it was a typographical shtick. It wasn't even an oral shtick. Chris goes on, he says, if voice is real, it will emerge on its own, whether we want it to or not. If it's an illusion or a mannerism, we'll only delude and limit ourselves by picking one and sticking with it. I think less about finding my own voice than not offending it, not writing anything I couldn't actually bring myself to say. He goes on a little bit beyond that, but yeah, I was interested in this claim. I think less about finding my own voice than not offending it, not writing anything I couldn't actually bring myself to say. And I think I have a similar instinct, though maybe not quite exactly the same, because I could bring myself to say, maybe it's sort of along the lines of what Ryan and I have talked about, where you don't want to have to wince or wink in order to say it. You want to be able to say it with a straight face, even if what you're saying is a speech in the voice of a murderer or a speech in the voice of a dragon or whatever. You want it to be credible to itself somehow. So if that's what he means, then I'm very much with him. It's funny, I don't think about that as being my voice. I think about that as being my ear. But maybe his point is that that's, your ear is more, your ear for what is credible, your ear for what sounds right to you or sounds true to you is maybe a more important test of and tool for identifying your own voice than any kind of shtick or style from poem to poem to poem. This essay, particularly his citing of heteroglossia, reminded me of an essay by Ryan from 7 years ago. I think he wrote it a little before that, but I remember he published it 7 years ago. It was in the Birmingham Poetry Review. This is an essay. It was Ryan as Ryan Wilson. The other thing that is true reading both of these essays is that I've had a lot of conversations with both of these guys about a lot of this sort of stuff. And Chris, in his essay, cites Ryan, he cites SLEERICKETS, he cites Jonathan. Ryan quotes a billion different things in his essay. It is sort of fun and familiar to me to encounter these specific crystallizations of what feels to me like a big, sprawling, ongoing conversation. And I'll talk about it again in another episode, but like listening to some recordings of poets of another generation, I got that feel. I had that feeling confirmed that this is how it often goes. That you have ideas that you work out aloud or maybe over letters or emails with your friends, and then at some point you write something down. But just the fact that you wrote it down doesn't mean that's the final or definitive version of it. The conversation continues. But this is an excellent essay as well. It's called The Polyvocal Poet by Ryan. It is largely an essay about how translation makes you a better poet. It is he talks a lot about specific translations and he praises translation as a practice. But while I know Ryan is a good translator and cares a lot about translation, in Chris's essay, he's really treating translation as an end in itself. Ryan, though he respects translation as an end in itself, in this essay, he is, I would say, mostly treating translation as a kind of a means to an end, or as a vehicle for understanding poetry. He takes the requisite shots in the beginning at free verse poets, aligning them historically with people who advocated a fundamentally, like a nationalistic poetic style and the pursuit of manifest destiny across the continent. Almut Majmadar has said similar things. That's some white people conquest kind of shit. Like, free verse is the white man imposing his style on the world. But he quotes at some length James Russell Lowell, who was not a believer in the development of an essential American style of poetry. He thought, there were times when, as has happened, again and again and again across history, this was a time when a little bit before Whitman published Leaves of Grass, Americans became self-conscious about not just being latter-day Europeans, not just echoing Europe. I think was it Schiller who had a whole essay about how like Germans needed to stop trying to be British? I think it was because all Germans were obsessed with Shakespeare. I think I think that was his essay. Anyway, this has happened in, country after country after country, century after century after century. Hey, let's get away from this other foreign influence and let's be ourselves. I think the Russians have said similar things about, being too obsessed with the French at different times. But Russell's argument, which Ryan very much echoes and elaborates on, was, hey, wait a minute, what are you fucking talking about? Every poet we admire was drawing from the past and was drawing from other places. He says it detracts nothing from Chaucer that we can trace in him the influence of Dante and Boccaccio, nothing from Spenser that he calls Chaucer master, nothing from Shakespeare that he acknowledges how dear Spenser was to him, nothing from Milton that he brought fire from Hebrew and Greek altars. There is no degradation in such indebtedness. It means the indebtedness of literary tradition. And Ryan takes up the term classical tradition, and he does it with a lot of apology, saying, like, this is not a perfect term for what I mean, and there is no perfect term for what I mean, and I don't mean exactly what everybody else means when they say the classical tradition. But what he is talking about is the reaching back, whether it's specifically the Western tradition or, as he points to, the many different traditions, not just in the West. The poets, he says, writers from all over the world and from all time periods have written in this tradition, which is less about specific texts and more about the process of creation. He says, and this is, I don't know if he's being totally sincere here, but it's definitely being evocative. He says, I use the imprecise phrase classical tradition only because the figure of Aeneas seems to me the best avatar of the process I'm attempting to describe. Aeneas, of course, is a Trojan who flees Troy during the burning of the city with his father on his back. And he goes to found Rome, in another part of the world. So this is Ryan says, like, Aeneas was the Roman progenitor, right? But he was not Roman. He was Trojan. Though he says there is a tradition that maybe, way, 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 way back, Aeneas's people were originally Italian. But the point is that we are not less ourselves because we draw from the past, and we're not less of our time and place because we draw from another time and place. Borges, makes a similar argument in The Argentine Writer and Tradition, saying, we're not going to become more authentically Argentine by writing about cowboy shit. We're going to be more authentically Argentine by trying to do the best writing we can, just the way the Greeks did. The Greeks weren't trying to sound Greek. They weren't trying to pick specifically Greek fruits and specifically Greek clothing and specifically Greek birds to write about. They were trying to write about the universe. Ryan's point is not just, because he's less concerned with a call for a national style, which is not really that was not the zeitgeist of 2018, nor, geez, God help us. I hope that's not coming. I hope we're not going to suddenly have like Curtis Yarvin leading the way in a call for a national, authentic American poetry. That would be such a fucking drag. What Ryan is very gently and very delicately addressing, and I would say very obliquely addressing in this essay, is the search for a slightly different kind of authenticity in contemporary poetry. That is, contemporary American poets are less likely to say, well, what is truly authentically American about my poetry, than they are to say, what is really authentic to me and my own person, whether that's my own person as somebody who's experienced a certain trauma, or somebody who has a certain identity, or somebody who has a certain heritage, or somebody whose family has a certain belongs to an identifiable demographic group. He does not dismiss those concerns or those sources of inspiration, but he maybe offers a slightly different possible emphasis. He says, the poet in the classical tradition relies far less upon his or her own specialness and far more on what Aristotle termed the hexis. I'm having to follow his transliteration of the Greek. And Aquinas called the habitus, which I don't know what the fuck he's referring to there because I haven't read Aquinas. The hexis is a reference to the Nicomachean Ethics, I think, a habit of being. Aquinas called the habitus a continual process of the good choosing the good, or to modify the terms, a continual process of the poet choosing poetry. This is where I think he articulates something that feels familiar to like some conversations I've had with him over the years, but it also feels like it really gets at my sense of how voice works. And how an authentic individual voice grows out of one person's extended investment in and interaction with the tradition. He says the poet must devote as much time as possible to reading, studying, memorizing, writing, revising, and so forth in order to be prepared should inspiration for a poem strike. This is, I guess, the term we would use the term. The old term is allude, and the new term is subtweet. He's subtweeting Randall Jarrell. Not trusting individual genius alone to make lightning strike, the poet in the classical tradition attempts to equip herself with a good lightning rod. Few are better than translation. And this is, I've heard this from every good translator I know, that writing in translation is a great aid to writing original poetry as well. It is nothing keeps you ready for the intervention of the muse like steady work on translation. He says that the habit of translation may also allow the poet access to motifs. This is really, he's really laying out here that idea of the kind of the verbal hoard, not just the word hoard, but like the hoard of all uses of language. He spells that out, I think, beautifully here. He says that this habit of translation may also allow the poet access to motifs, rhetorical schemes, figures, diction, metrical arrangements, and images, often archetypal and rooted deep in human consciousness, that the poet might not have discovered through personal inspiration alone. That is a wild understatement. That personal inspiration alone might not have supplied you with all of the treasures of antiquity. As these patterns and words and images and musical arrangements sift down in the memory, they often combine on the river bottom in unexpected and Selkouth patterns. I had to look up Selkouth, Ryan. I had to look up words for both of these essays because these guys are too fucking smart. Selkouth, I couldn't quite follow the etymology. Couth has to do with the familiar, the known. Sell seems not maybe related to seldom, but seat, it's the seat of familiar. Anyway, Selkouth means like obscure or rare or unfamiliar. So again, like that, the etymology didn't quite register for me. He goes on, from such combinations, a distinct new poetry may leap up dolphin-like into the light, a poetry in which the voices of the poet's masters may sing harmony even with the melody of the poet's original lines. This is that inner landscape. If you are what you eat as a poet, you are absolutely what you read. Reading and hearing, listening, taking in language shapes how you make language, shapes how you understand language, builds that inner landscape. I think his vision of the pattern of the silt on the river bottom is quite beautiful and I think evocative. And in that same kind of subtle way, the pattern of the silt and the rocks along the river bottom will change the course of the water, sometimes gently and sometimes violently. This sort of poetry, he goes on, is not properly translation at all, but what I would term polyvocal poetry. In polyvocal poetry, allusions are not at all pretentious references to other works, for the other works have become part of the self of the poet. The poet pretends to nothing. That's an old complaint of mine. That's a complaint of a person who's been called pretentious many times in his life. Is like, what am I pretending to, motherfucker? I promise you, I am sincerely this dorky. But this is Ryan's idea of polyvocal poetry, which is a specific kind of many-voiced poetry, plural voice in poetry. So if Chris is concerned with like voice as being, there's the voice of the sort of the inevitable shape of the author's own of style as a writer, but then much more important is the set of individual demands of the given poem or of the given poet you're working with. That each occasion we should, as much as possible, let go of our sense of what my shtick is as a poet. And I should, as much as possible, he cites Frost. I hadn't thought about, I believe Frost said this about himself, but Chris cites Frost as saying that like he tried to make every poem sound as different from the other poems as possible. And I thought like, well, I don't know, man, I've read your poems, Bob. They sound like you. But for Chris, voice is sort of like it's an inevitability in compelling writing, but it's also a sort of an unhelpful fixation for the most part. Ryan is talking about plurality of voice in a slightly different way. He is also talking about the kind of the inevitable formation of one writer's individual style over time, but it is made up of all of the voices of the poets who have influenced him. And sometimes those voices are cited verbatim. There are phrases that come up. He spends most of the essay talking about two odes of Horace's, 125 and 220, and then various translations of them, notably Hecht's rendering The Whirligig of Time of Horace 125, and Robert Penn Warren's rendering Heart of Autumn of Horace 220. Both of those are imitations. Warren's is a much looser imitation. Ryan says it's not even really an imitation. That basically there's close. There are different types of translation. He cites Dryden's different terms. I'm not going to try to recapitulate all that. You should go read Ryan's essay. He also has a book of essays that this is going to be in that I think is coming out sometime in the next year or two with, it might be Wiseblood or it might be one of the Catholic presses. I don't know, but it's going to be really good. This was originally in Birmingham Review, but I think that's paywalled. Though, go pay for the Birmingham Review. Adam Vines is a good editor. But Ryan talks about how in these poems there are little snatches of original phrases or constructions that do bleed through. There are literal quotations. And we read Hecht's poem on a previous episode, and the title "The Whirligig of Time" is a quotation from, I think it's Festi in Twelfth Night. The Whirligig of Time brings in his revenges, and in the same poem he quotes Sonnet 18, the Darling Buds of May, in a poem that is a loose translation imitation of a poem by a totally different poet. So it's very, very common for poets to echo and bring up little snatches and parts of other poets' work. He cites I think it's 220, Horace 220, where it was not until we discovered the Brothers poem by Sappho in recent years that we realized he was actually cribbing from her in this poem. So poets do this since forever. In addition to literal cribs and quotations and allusions, there are also subtler echoes of other poets' work. There are cryptoamnesiac quotation. I didn't realize I have a poem called Sonnet for My Daughters where I lifted wholesale the line from Miniver Cheevy by Robinson and thought. I lifted that and put that into the poem. We just didn't even realize it at all. Even I recorded an episode the other day with Brian about a Dan Coas essay on Dave Eggers, as well as a really, really funny Borges story about a bad poet. But in that, it didn't occur to me until we had finished up the conversation that even the title, A Heartbreaking Work of Staggering Genius, Dave Eggers' big breakout memoir, that title was perversely the model in my mind for the original name of this podcast, which is still, when I sign into Apple Podcasts as the person who runs this podcast, the official handle address for SLEERICKETS in the Apple Podcast system is what was going to be the original name of the show, which was A Total Fucking Shambles. And definitely that sort of, snide, self-mocking grandiosity was totally a crib from Dave Eggers. Though I haven't read much of him, I did read that book and I liked it. So this is sort of what Ryan is talking about when he talks about the polyvocal poetry, is poetry that is sort of literally made up of the voices of all of these other poets, that work in harmony with the poets, with the new poet's own developing style. It is a kind of a slightly micro level application of the principles at work in Eliot's tradition and the individual talent. That every good new poet is made up of all of the poets who came before him, but a really major new poet subtly reflects back differently on everybody who came before him and changes the tradition into which he has entered. I won't quote a whole lot more from Ryan's essay. He does have, I think, the line where he has, I think, quite a lovely concluding sentiment about kind of inviting people to the tradition. And he is very, very open about, Ryan is a big C Catholic, but I would say he is even more of a small C Catholic than he is a big C Catholic. He is a great, great believer in plurality, in xenia, in hospitality, in bringing in different styles and sources and stories and wanting to learn and take in as much as possible. And that if you have access to a language, then you are the proud possessor of all of that language's literary tradition. It belongs to you just as authentically as it belongs to anyone else. So I'll just quote the last line I'll quote is, he says, "The poet who acknowledges no tradition at all will have a very difficult time writing good poetry." I think he's pretty right about that. The other thing I wanted to say about the two odes of Horace that he quotes, both of these, one of these, Horace 125, I know I have at least cited on this podcast before. It is one of Horace's very meanest poems. It is a malediction against a woman who jilted him in the past. Or actually, I don't know if she jilted him. She ignored him. She turned him down. Where's my? Because to me, what leapt out was that there's a different. He's sort of interested in each of these odes as an occasion, both for the fruitful work of translation that kind of that stirs up the poet's mind, and as an occasion for examining the work of different translators, trying to capture different aspects of the original. And he does a really good job of close reading all of these different translations of these poems, translations and imitations. But what stood out to me about this pairing of these two odes, 125 and 220, is that they demonstrate to me the binary quality of the particular sensitivity to voice that I was talking about with Jonathan. That is, Horace 125, it's mean as hell. It's arguably misogynistic, but it is totally credible. I absolutely believe a human being is saying this, right? It is totally, totally, totally believable as a thing spoken by an entity. Whereas Horace 220 feels, I think he even is addressing Maecenas. Like he's addressing his friend Maecenas in it. And yet, the way he's talking and the stuff he's talking about, like the thing he's saying to Maecenas just feels so palpably artificial. All poetry is artificial, but it just feels like, what is this? Who would say this at what? I've heard this poem praised to the heavens. I know it is one of Ryan's favorites. I know it is a very accomplished poem. I know I can't really understand it in Latin, but this poem just epitomizes to me the failure to capture a credible voice. So I'll quickly read them to you because they're each about a page long, and they do provide pretty strong contrast. I'll start with the one that to me does not sound like a credible voice, and then I'll just let you hear the difference when I get back to the one that does sound like a human voice. And I'll try to read them. I'll try to be a good sport in reading both of them. This is Horace Ode 220. I'm just going to read Ferry's translations, which I know, but Ferry is a very hospitable translator. though I'm sure he loses much of the syntactical brilliance. If anybody can make a frosty, contrived Horatian ode sound convincingly human, it's David Ferry. And, he does his best here. This is Ode 220 by Horace, translated by David Ferry. By form, being a bard and being a bird, I'll take my flight up through the brilliant air on powerful wings, taking my leave of the city, taking my leave of envy, flying high. Dearest Maecenas, I declare that I, to whom you call, I, child of a former slave, will never die, that I will never be imprisoned by the waters of the Styx. Even as I speak, I feel the skin begin to loosen, pucker, and wrinkle about my ankles. I feel the feathers softly gather upon my shoulders and my arms, becoming wings. Melodious bird, I'll fly above the moaning Bosporus, more glorious than Icarus. I'll coast along above the coast of Sidra, and over the fabled Hyperborean steppes. The Colchians will hear, the Dacians too, who say they have no fear of Roman arms. And farther still the Galonians will listen. The Iberians by the Ebro they will listen, and those who drink the waters of the Rhone will learn to be more learned from my song. Therefore, when you in error think I've died, provide no ritual dirge, no eulogies, no grievers weeping noisily at my tomb. It's all superfluous. I won't be there. So as Ryan, I think smartly points out, he's talking here not just about being literally transformed into a bird, which he is describing. Yes, he is describing in this poem, he himself, Horace, being physically transformed into a bird. But he's also calling his shot when it comes to poetic immortality. He's saying, hey, when I'm dead, my grave is not going to be the place to find me. The place to find me is going to be my poems, where I will still be alive. It's a fine sentiment. The bird shit, like, what the fuck, man? It just sounds like Ferry does his best with it. But, like, I declare that I, to whom you call, I, child of a former slave, will never die, that I will never be imprisoned by the waters of the Styx. Even as I speak, I feel the skin begin to loosen, pucker, and wrinkle about my ankles. I feel the feathers softly gather upon my shoulders and my arms becoming wings. Melodious bird, I'll fly above the moaning Bosporus, more glorious than Icarus. I mean, it's evocatively described. Like, he does about as good a job as you can of, like, describing turning into a fucking bird. But, like, Jesus Christ, I just can't credit this for a minute. It just doesn't sound like it. I don't believe this is a person. It just sounds so phony. He sounds like he's being phony and saying it. I don't mean that this sounds like it was artificially put together. All poems are artificially put together. It sounds like he's doing a bit, and it's not even a very funny bit. Contrast that with this. To Lydia. This is that was the 220. Ferry tags that as to Maecenas. He tags this one as to Lydia. They're not titled in the original. This is Ode 125 by Horace, also translated by David Ferry. It happens less and less often now that you wake up to hear the sound of gravel thrown against your shuttered windows in the night. It's very seldom now that you can't sleep the whole night through. There used to be a time the hinges of the door to your house moved ever so easily back and forth. Not anymore. It's very seldom, Lydia, now, that you can hear a lover out in the dark complain, "Oh, Lydia, Lydia, why are you sound asleep while all night long I suffer in the alley?" You're going to have your turn out there alone. Old crone in the nighttime alley weeping over your faithless boyfriends while the north wind, coming down from the Thracian cold, blows ever louder and louder through the dark of the moon, and ulcerating lust, such as the lust that tortures the mare in heat tortures your heart. Out there in the night you'll moan that all the young men prefer the lustrous ivy and lustrous myrtle to the withered leaves that winter's companion the cold wind causes to scatter and scrape along the alley. So he also uses some transformative, imagery here. He says she's experiencing what the mare, the female horse in heat experiences. He uses some figurative language to point out how her shutters are stuck together and her wind is stuck to her door is stuck to the door jamb. Everything else around her is paired up and married, but not her. He compares her to dry leaves skittering along the alley at the end. But here, all of these images serve a human purpose, which is to hurt her feelings, to make Lydia feel like shit. He has clearly been hurt by her. He wants to make her feel pain, and he uses all of his poetic gifts toward that end. That makes sense to me. It is not nice. It is shitty. It is maybe misogynistic and patriarchal and whatever, but it's totally human. Whereas, what is the occasion when you explain to your rich friend that you're going to turn into a bird? Okay. I mean, the real occasion is when that rich friend is the one who got you the farm because he's buddies with the emperor. And if he tells you, hey, write me a poem about you turning into a bird, you say, sir, yes, sir. How long would you like it to be? And in what stanzaic form? But it just doesn't, to me, that's the striking difference between these two poems is that one of them achieves a credible poetic voice, as speakability, spokenness, the voice of the speaker, the voice of the poem, however you want to break it down. That's the kind of voice I was talking to Jonathan about. The other thing that stood out to me is that there is yet another kind of vocal plurality in poetry that I'm interested in. Chris talks about this, the poet's ability to be flexible and to jump into lots of different voices and lots of different poems, and not to be too precious about his own voice, which I totally am in agreement with. I'm totally with him there. Ryan talks about how each poet is influenced by and even made up of in his own voice all the voices of poets in the past, both specific poems and a kind of a larger, to the extent to which any individual poet has a style or a sound. We are also made up of all of those generic style, those, personal stamps and trademarks. We are influenced by those. That's why, there are poets who are too influenced by a poet. The reason I don't read Larkin for pleasure or Hausman for pleasure anymore is that I know they're both very infectious, and whatever influence they've had on me, I don't necessarily want to encourage a lot more, right? Alice McDermott said the same thing about Flannery O'Connor. She doesn't read her anymore. Not because she doesn't love her, but because she loves her too well, and because if you read a bunch of Flannery O'Connor stories in a row, all you want to do is write Flannery O'Connor stories. So those are two kinds of vocal plurality in poetry that I totally believe in and can be wonderful and are, I try to make good use of. There's another kind, which is there's dialogue, right? They're dialogue poems, literal dialogue poems, whether that's a stage play, the script for a stage play, or whether it's like Andrew Marvell's boring ass soul and body poems where soul says this and body says that, or Milton's little sonnet, When I Consider How My Light Is Spent, when he has literally patience flies into the poem and gives him a little, pep talk at the end. The dream songs, of course, are famously polyvocal in the sense, not in Ryan's sense, but in the sense that, in Ryan's sense, but also in the sense that there are literally different voices piping in, right? There ought to be a law against Henry, Mr. Bones, there is. There are people speaking sometimes next to each other, sometimes to each other. He, as Rubber Pinsky pointed out in the essay that Jonathan and I read through a little bit of in the voice episode, he uses the weirdness of that polyphony as an excuse to bring in other additionally strange words that might not fit into a single voice comfortably. Ozymandias, of course, has a famous intrusion of another voice in the middle of it. Look on my works, ye mighty in despair. That's not Shelley talking. Ostensibly, most of the poem is not even Shelley talking. The poem is Shelley talking is, I met a traveler in an antique land. And then the traveler in an antique land sort of relates this story. And then within that story, we get a quotation from Ozymandias himself. I think of one of my very, very favorite poems. I shared it with Matt Wall the other day. He had never read it, and he was blown away by it. I was very touched. Like, it's not at all his style, but I showed him. He grew up very in a very evangelical family, I believe. I think his family was like Pentecostals or something. But he made some joke about noli me tangere, the Latin "touch me not," from the Latin Vulgate Bible. That's what Jesus is supposed to say to Mary. I can't remember if it's Mary Magdalene or the other Mary who comes to him in the garden after the resurrection, and he says, "Touch me not." He made some joke about that because that's the kind of joke you make when you're raised an evangelical. And I sent him Thomas Wyatt's "Whoso Lists to Hunt, I Know Where Is in Hind." Just amazing. I mean, just one of my very favorite sonnets. I'm sure I've read it on the episode before. Very, very famous poem. It is, it's vocally plural in several ways. It is all, very apparently an allegory, a kind of a somewhat like deliberately hand-tipping allegory about hunting a deer, when really it is clearly at least partly about chasing after a woman, possibly Anne Boleyn, definitely somebody who's off limits. And then within that, he reads the graven in diamonds and letters plain, there is written her fair neck round about. So when he confronts the deer in the poem, she's wearing a diamond collar, and written on the collar is "Noli me tangere, for Caesar's I am, and wild for to hold though I seem tame." Wild for to hold though I seem tame is, I would argue, like one of the hottest things ever written in the English language. But so it's not just that is itself a quotation from the collar. It's also that within that quotation, there's a quotation, right? Because "Noli me tangere" is Jesus speaking. But then that language is being adopted by the people who put the collar on Caesar's deer. And of course, Caesar is himself, in this case, probably King Henry VIII. So, there's all sorts of vocal plurality in poetry, but I am interested in maybe this slightly, subtly different kind. That is another thing quite yet. And it does come up a little bit in my conversation with Brian about Dave Eggers, but the simplest and smallest example that came to mind was Western Wind. Very famous little 4-line anonymous stanza from 400 or 500 years ago. "Western wind, when will thou blow? The small rain down can rain. Christ, that my love were in my arms, and I in my bed again." So it's just 4 lines, 2 little utterances. And I don't even think that there's a major shift here, but the intrusion of that Christ, which I think that there was a time when this was introduced as like the lyrics to a song in church, with the excuse that like Christ was an invocation or apostrophe, not what it obviously is, which is an exclamation, a curse word, taking the Lord's name in vain. But the intrusion of that other voice that is not a different person's voice. It's not like the first 2 lines are spoken by one guy who's a farmer and the other guy is spoken by a different guy who's a slightly hornier farmer. No, they're both spoken by the same guy, but in 2 slightly different voices. And they're both true voices. They're both voices belonging to the farmer, but just as we do in our daily lives, Chris points out that voice is a thing you do, and like when you speak to customers, you have a certain type of, you speak in a certain way. When you speak to your family, you speak in a certain way. When you speak to your boys, you speak in a certain way. If you're Chris, you speak to everybody in the same way all the time, apparently. And that's why you're such a bad waiter and such a good translator. But there's that little hint there of a hiccup in the voice, that he's not continuing in quite exactly the mode that he started in. It's very, very subtle, but the stronger and more salient example of this same phenomenon that came to mind when I was reading Ryan's essay was actually not a poem at all, but I think a rightly very celebrated and very short piece of English composition. He has a passage where he's talking about Horace's use of the Latin for dedicate. He says, partly my sense that this translation is best derives from the previous similar images, but also it partly derives from the ironic tone of dedicate, devotes or consigns. That is, dedicate has a ritualistic or religious significance. In fact, its secondary definition is to consecrate or dedicate a temple, and the word suggests a purposeful and solemn action. Of course, such a suggestion is incongruous with how Horace claims the young men will treat the dead leaves. Horace clearly intends that young men will take no conscious action toward dead leaves, but ignore them entirely. Moreover, another definition of dedico is to make a return of property to the censor. Consequently, we may see the wind here as a kind of magistrate, a ruler, and Lydia herself imaged here as the dead leaves is merely property that will be given back to the magistrate, back to the wind. So this extensive play with the meaning of the word dedicate and how it can be used both to apply a greater meaning to something or to give something up, to give something over, and how it is frequently used in application to the dead, or used here in application to the dead, and used differently, used with a play and meaning. What that immediately called to mind, again, in the loose Selkouth silt patterns on the bottom of my own internal verbal river, of the ripples in my own word hoard. What that summoned to mind was probably the most famous piece of writing in English that is built, the rhetorical motion of which is built entirely around a play on the meaning of the word dedicate. And I'm speaking, of course, of the Gettysburg Address by Abraham Lincoln, delivered November 19th, 1863. And I went back and I reread it, and I noted a couple things. One is that the whole poem, what turns the whole poem, I'm calling it a poem, the whole speech, what turns all of it is his deliberate equivocation over the meaning of the word dedicate. Two is that he includes a little phrase, and even the way he cites that phrase also very strongly echoed Horace. He has a sentence here, the syntax of which feels to me like, I'm not a Latinist, I'm not a classicist, but like what all of my classicist friends say they love so much about Horace is there are these long, winding, periodic sentences in which he stacks everything up in such a way that the order of the words in the sentence recapitulates the meaning of the content of the sentence, and it finally ends on the word that changes, that gives, that usually a verb that provides the essential meaning that retroactively charges the rest of the sentence with the force that it would not have otherwise. Lincoln has at least one sentence that feels like it is almost like hilariously Horatian. And the last thing that I noticed was that this is a composition in which he is speaking in multiple voices, and they fight with each other, and the speech achieves its peak. It achieves its greatest power when he finds a way to integrate those two distinct voices. So I'll read through it maybe once or twice, and there's a lot that's been said about the poem's similarities to Pericles' funeral oration and the King James Bible and various other things, and I'm not going to try to get into all that. I'm just sort of interested in this one particular rhetorical quality, which is the collision of different voices, both spoken by the speaker, right? Not somebody else interjecting, and not just a quotation or citation, though he does a little bit of what I think you could argue is that here, but the same person speaking in multiple voices. I also think this speech might be, I'm sure it's an older tradition than this, but the trope in like literally every public speech given in every TV show or movie ever by anybody at any public occasion. The convention is you stand up there with your note cards and you start to speak something stilted and formal from your note cards, and then you say, you know what? I'm just going to speak from the heart. I think Lincoln might have invented that, or at least invented the American version of that. So here we go. Here's the speech, the Gettysburg Address. Famously, the guy who spoke before him, there was several different things in the program. He didn't speak immediately before him, but there was a guy who spoke before him who spoke for 2 hours, and then Lincoln spoke for 2 minutes. 87 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on this great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate. We cannot consecrate. We cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here. But it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here, to the unfinished work, which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. So if I remember, the program listed him as giving the dedication, as dedicating. So they were establishing a cemetery, a soldier cemetery on, as he says, a portion of the battlefield. And he was, I believe, that language, dedicate, to give. He was assigned to give the dedication. I believe that was language somebody else gave to him. It was sort of a standard formal thing that one did at this kind of event. And so there, I read this poem as doing. I keep calling it a poem. I read this speech as doing, as using sort of the vocal plurality in all of these different senses at once. For one thing, he does specifically quote other people. He quotes Thomas Jefferson, right? Dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Famous and infamous 5 words from the Declaration of Independence. I can't help but hear, particularly because I believe it was immediately before or immediately after, but definitely listed in the program, there was a song sung that was called, what was it? I'm going to find this title for you because it's insane what it was called. Good old Wikipedia listed the program. Yeah, the program that Wills, I don't know who Wills, the committee that put together the event. The program that Wills and his committee organized for the day was music by Bergfeld's band, prayer by Reverend T.H. Stockton, Old Hundred performed by the U.S. Marine Band, oration by the Honorable Edward Everett, The Battles of Gettysburg, that was the 2-hour speech, music hymn by B.B. French, Esquire, dedicatory remarks by the President of the United States. So that, I think dedicatory remarks, I think like that was language that he was handed when he was asked to do this. And then what that was, the Gettysburg fucking address was followed up by dirge, "Oh, it is great for our country to die," which is, one would argue maybe like an infelicitous syntactical inversion in that case, because perhaps he means what Horace meant, which was dulce et decorum est pro patria mori, sweet and proper it is to die for one's country. But it also appears to be saying that it is great for our country to die, which is maybe not the sentiment one wants to hear after the bloodiest day of a incredibly bloody civil war. And then it closed with a benediction by the Reverend H.L. Bauger. But I can't help but hear in this context, when he says it is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. Fitting and proper, those are both words. Fitting and proper are both words that are used to translate decorum in Horace's famous motto, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori, sweet and proper or sweet and fitting it is to die for one's country, to die for the fatherland. My suspicion is that dulce et decorum est was in Lincoln's mind, and he knew that for a speech at a funeral after the Battle of Gettysburg, which was the battle that turned the tide, but this was still 1863 when they did this address, when they gave this address. It was not, the war was by no means over. Actually, had he just barely been reelected then? I can't remember. It would have been right around Election Day, right? When was Election Day 1863? Let me see. The last day of voting was November 3rd, but given the technology of the time, it's not clear to me whether he would have even known then. Like if it would have been actually reported and decided and certified by then. Anyway, it was a delicate moment. And I think he was aware that this was not the time to, it would not have been fitting or proper to say sweet in this context. And so he replaced sweet with a synonym for proper. I can't help but hear that, partly because he says it is fitting and proper that we should do this. And of course he's about to compare what they are doing at this moment unfavorably with what the soldiers have done, which is exactly die for country, die for fatherland, pro patria mori. But also because he's making an observation about what they are doing in that moment. He's commenting on the thing he's doing. He's addressing the fact that he's making a speech. That opening sentence, which is beautiful and powerful and deliberately evokes the Declaration of Independence, is followed up by a much more matter-of-fact assessment of the ground situation. He starts with this high-flown rhetoric that calls us back to the founding of the country, and then in the second paragraph, he brings us back to the present and to the uncertainty as to whether that great project is even going to survive, is he even can survive. And when he addresses what they're doing that moment, we're dedicating a little patch of ground for a cemetery for soldiers. He offers a verdict on it. He offers a verdict on the thing he's doing in that moment. He's the one dedicating the patch of ground. He's giving the dedicatory remarks. And he says, it is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. Okay, all right. And yes. And to me, this is the essence of this particular kind of vocal plurality. I recognize it all the time in things I do. There's a certain voice I have to use when I'm talking to my daughters about what to fucking do. My dog recognizes it because she knows when I'm telling them that we're going to have to go somewhere. Even when I still have my slippers on, even when I'm not anywhere near the front door, she recognizes in my voice when I'm saying all right, girls, and she gets nervous and runs to the door. Right? There's a certain voice I use when I talk on this podcast. I try not to, let the artifice become distorting, but there's a certain voice I use when I'm speaking in front of a live crowd. There's a voice I used when I was speaking as a teacher. And these are not phony or false voices. These are voices that we adopt for certain occasions. And that's what he's doing here. And then he's doing what I think good rhetoricians have learned a long time ago is a way to convey a sense of authenticity, which is to call attention to the voice that one is adopting. So having summoned the spirit of the founders, he then soberly addresses the present moment and the very thing he's attempting to do in the words he's speaking in this moment. And then he challenges the whole premise. Right? He's been told, we would like you to give some remarks to dedicate this ground to the soldiers. And he knows how he's supposed to start, and he starts the speech right. Right? This is the rhetoric you want to hear from a president. 67 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And, it's not coincidental that he was representing, of course, the United States, the Union, which I don't think the Union was always fighting with the freedom of Southern slaves at the front of its mind. But what is true is that the South was definitely fighting for the perpetuation of slavery. And it's not true of like every individual conscripted poor Confederate soldier, but it is true of the Confederacy as a whole, that the Union had a lot of complicated reasons for existing. The Confederacy had one fairly uncomplicated reason for existing. And the equality of all men was a question at hand. So, he's hitting his marks perfectly in that first sentence. But then he has to step back and level with the audience. And then after he's leveled with them, he has to say, you know what? It's fitting and proper that we should do this, but actually, I'm not even sure it's possible, and I'm not even sure. I think maybe we've got this completely backwards. I think we're saying that we're going to dedicate this ground to the soldiers, but instead, that's not what needs dedicating at all. We can't make this ground any more holy than they've made it by spilling their blood here. We don't need to dedicate. They're done dedicating anything. This ground is more dedicated than we could ever make it. They dedicated it. What still needs dedicating is us. Right? And this is, again, he's playing over and over and over again with the different meanings of the word dedicate, right? Which is rhetoric. In the moment of like acknowledging artifice, in the very fact of tearing down the stiff, contrived pattern of the speech, he is making use of rhetorical artifice. Which is, again, like a classic rhetorical, like this is great speech making 101. And then I would say that it's in kind of this, he breaks in, he interrupts himself. Another like I mentioned this in my conversation with Brian, like another example of a poem lots of people don't like, but that does use this particular kind of vocal plurality where it's another voice intruding that is also spoken by the speaker of the poem, not as a quotation and not as a secondary speaker, but as another utterance from the speaker herself is, of course, the famous interjection in the last line of One Art, though it can look like write it like disaster. He has a lot of those in here. He says, he corrects himself. We cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. It's both correction and anaphora. The world will little note, nor long remember. But it's not just that they're not going to pay attention now. They're not going to remember after the fact either. What we say here. He's talking, what we say here is what he is saying as he is saying what we say here. What we say here is literally the words what we say here. So he's referring to what he's saying as he's saying it. He's correcting what he's saying as he's saying it. He's interjecting with parentheticals. He's stacking up clauses. And it is when he finally begins to integrate these two different modes of speech, these two different conflicting voices, that the speech really achieves its greatest heights. The sentence I wanted to call your attention to is the sentence that follows the line about how nobody's going to remember what we're saying here. This is the Horatian sentence, I think. It is for us the living, rather. This is an example of, I would say, like an eloquent use of ineloquence, like a very effective and graceful and athletic use of clumsiness. That he's deliberately constructed this sentence. The syntax of it is so tortured and so deliberate and so halting that it forces you to follow the train of thought through it, and begins to acquire a certain kind of emphatic force, particularly when you recognize that what he's describing is the difficulty, the struggle, the pain, the slowness, the inch-by-inch progression of trying to fight a war. And that if and when one actually makes progress, which they just barely had started to do at this point, the Union. I mean, the Union was getting whipped. They were just getting their asses kicked. The Union had shitty general after shitty general after shitty general. They just kept having more men, and they finally started to get some real fighters coming in at the end. There was a lot of bloodshed from the North. I mean, the Northern Army was cannon fodder for a lot of this war. And he builds this clumsy, halting, struggling sentence that seems to enact the difficulty of that progress. And it finally and only in the very end identifies the forward motion that has been achieved. Here's the sentence. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. That is a hard-won sentence. Finally to make it to the finish line of advanced. And that we are, that we have to do something, but our doing it is already, spiritually, historically, and syntactically tangled up in the thing that these men have done. We cannot pull one apart from the other. They've given everything, and now we're on the hook. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. And this is the great inversion. No, we're not dedicating anything here. We're not the ones doing the dedicating. We are the ones who need to become dedicated. We need to be this soil that gets consecrated, that gets hallowed. It is time for us to be elevated. We can't elevate anything else any more than they've already done it. And then he arrives at the peroration of that great final long last sentence that is, again, it's a series of interrupting. It's an anaphora as interruption, or interruption as anaphora, and it begins to reclaim some of that, the invocation to God, the high register of the language, the conjuring of great, inspiring, abstract nouns. He finds a way back to the rhetoric of the opening sentence through the mud of all of the struggle of the sentences intervening. If this entire speech were written in the mode of the first sentence, it would be not something I had ever heard of. It would be an utterly forgettable, perfectly acceptable, irreproachable presidential address. But it is precisely the variation and tension between the voices in the poem. Jesus, I guess I'm convinced this is a poem in some sense. But it is all of that tension and that struggle and that friction, the collision, the difference in texture between the voices in the speech that gives it its power. I'll read it one more time and then I'll sign off because this has gone on for a long time. The Gettysburg Address by Abraham Lincoln, November 19th, 1863. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now, we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on this great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But, in a larger sense, We cannot dedicate. We cannot consecrate. We cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here. But it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. All right, that's enough for tonight. Thank you for listening. You can reach me, as always, at sleerickets@gmail.com. Go check out The Secret Show, sleerickets.substack.com. I have some thoughts on what I'm going to record for that one. It's going to be a little bit of a mess, I think. And with any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.